Hello YouTube. So I wanted to do a video opposing two different pictures of how to think of Christianity. And I think you could do this. You could do this probably with any religion, but I'm going to try and Christianity is the one that I think I'm most capable of talking about. So. One way of thinking of Christianity is to think of Christianity as a system of beliefs or a certain ideology that is defined by a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. You know, to be called a Christian, you need to believe this set of things. Right? Now, you can fill in the gaps as to what those might be. Things like the virgin birth, the resurrection, I don't know what else, the Trinity, right? Stuff like that. Now that's one way to look at Christianity. I would call that the fundamentalist view, or the you could call this the transcendental model of Christianity. Now, I don't think that view is sufficient. I don't think that it explains the phenomena of Christianity. I don't think that that things actually work that way. The fact is, Christianity is a very, very old and complex system. And that view of Christianity does not take the historical dimension of Christianity into account, right? It's almost like it's almost an attempt to describe something that is outside of history that you can then apply to different historical time periods to define what Christianity is. This for me isn't it's just not satisfactory. It doesn't I think encapsulate the reality of what's happening. So against this transcendental model of Christianity, I would propose what I would call a historicist model of Christianity, or a Nietzschean view of Christianity, kind of, or a Marxian view, if you like. But I'm going to read a passage from Nietzsche to illustrate the point that I want to make. Quote, "The Christian Church is an encyclopedia of prehistoric cults and conceptions of the most diverse origin, and that is why it is so capable of proselytizing. It always could, and it can still, go wherever it pleases, and it always found and always finds something similar to itself, which it can adapt itself and gradually impose upon it a Christian meaning. It is not what is Christian in it, but the universal heathen character of its uses which has favored the spread of this world religion. Its ideas, rooted in both the Jewish and Hellenic world, have from the first known how to raise themselves above national and racial niceties and exclusiveness as though these were merely prejudices. One may admire this power of causing the most various elements to coalesce, but one must not forget the contemptible quality that adheres to this power. The astonishing crudeness and self-satisfiedness of the Church's intellect during the time it was in process of formation, which permitted it to accept any food and to digest opposites like pebbles." Right. Now, clearly that's a polemical passage. Clearly that's part of an attack on Christianity. But the picture of Christianity that it presents is one that I think is much more viable. That is, it's not so much about that which is internal to it that defines Christianity. It is more its ability to adapt and subsume things outside of it that defines it, right? So two examples that we might point to are the Neoplatonist articulations of Christianity in the first few centuries, being Augustine of Hippo, Origen of Alexandria, right? The idea is we're going to Christianize Platonism. Another example, and Nietzsche has a great line where he says Christianity is Platonism for the people. The other example that you might take as good evidence would be the ability of Christianity to take pagan holidays and to pull them into itself, right? It's like saying you have Yule on December 21st to celebrate the winter solstice. Well, we're just going to put Christmas right here. And the idea being you don't really have to change how you celebrate, right? The Christmas tree is a pagan Germanic idea, right? All of the symbolism associated with Christianity or with Christmas, very little of it actually comes from Christianity. Mistletoe and stuff like that. So it's this ability to pull heathen things into itself and then to reinscribe them as Christian. Right? This is what makes Christianity such a powerhouse in history. The ability to move into any material situation and to reinscribe it as something Christian. Right? So what we find here is not a Christianity that's defined by some set of conditions, but rather what we find is a Christianity that is constantly re-articulating itself and rebuilding itself to sort of fit into all sorts of different political circumstances and material circumstances, right? And the way that it does this, as Nietzsche identifies it, is to consider itself to be above all of this, right? To consider all political realities and blah, 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 to be something that is merely provincial, or something that's like just a prejudice, right? And by conceiving of itself as above these things, it's able to pull in all these disparate elements into itself. But I don't think that that's actually the case, right? I think that there are, again, historical causes and conditions that Christianity is perpetually rebuilding itself to react to. So how we might categorize Christianity, or how we might taxonomize Christianity at this level, is not so much to say, well, they don't believe in the resurrection and therefore they're not Christians, or something like that. But rather the way we would do it is similar to how we would taxonomize languages, right? There are lineages, or more accurately, genealogies of ideas that stretch back into history. So in the same way that we say French and Italian are Romance languages and we define them from what they came from, in the same way I think that we can say something like Jehovah's Witnesses are Christian in that they emerge out of a lineage of Christianity. Christianity here is conceived of as a very, very complex and old set of traditions that sort of branches out into different places. Now, what I want to say, where does this transcendental model of Christianity come from, right? Where does that appear, right, within this historicist model of Christianity? And it's actually very easy to point to. It comes with the Reformation, right? So the Catholic Church, and before it, before the Great Schism, right? The Church, let's say, to unify the Eastern Orthodox and Catholic churches, the Church, or the early Church, was the center of Christian discourse, right? That was the thing that defined dogma, right? That was the center that was able to make, or that was imbued with the authority to exclude, to define and exclude heretical practices, right? That's to say that's not what's Christian, right? But the fact is, the church was made up of living, breathing human beings, right? So it was something that could constantly be evaluated and reevaluated. New sort of doctrines were being added all the time. New interpretations of Christianity were being added all the time. St. Anselm's conception of penal substitution, for instance, in the High Middle Ages. St. Augustine's conception of original sin was something that was added in the 3rd century. So it's something that through the church, because the church is composed of living, breathing human beings, we're able to accept new doctrine and reject new doctrine, right? This is the mechanism by which the Bible was canonized, for instance. So that goes on historically. You have the Great Schism, so the church splits in two. You have Henry VIII breaking off. And then you have the Reformation. Now, the Reformation comes with it a certain problem, right? And that is that how do we define Christianity in the absence of the church, right? That's the central problem of Protestantism. And in the absence of the church, capital T, capital C, as an institution, right? Not the church as some, the mystical body of Christ or some other definition. This is a hard problem, right? Because you have all of a sudden a discourse without a center. And the answer that Martin Luther provides is sola scriptura, right? Scripture alone. The idea being the Bible is now going to be the center of our conversation. The Bible is going to be the metric by which we define ourselves, rather than the church. What I want to point out, though, is that move is something that happens in a time and a place and a context, right? That move coincides with the rise of capitalism in the Glorious Revolution in England, and blah, 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 blah. That move coincides with the rise of the nation state. That move coincides with standardization of various things, standardization of measurements, weights and measurements and stuff like that, and standardization of capital. All of these things happen sort of at the same time alongside Protestantism. So Protestantism takes place within this context, right? Protestantism as a move, I would say, only makes sense in relation to that context, that political context. All of a sudden it appears that we can have a Christianity without the church. And at that point, it's just a matter of time, right, before that happens. So the Bible becomes the center of discourse. Again, this is a new move. It's not something that stretches back into history. The Bible becomes the center of discourse. And according to Protestantism, anybody who reads the Bible, you don't need a mediator to interpret the Bible for you. Anybody who reads the Bible can get something out of it, basically. But that's insufficient, right? The Bible is insufficient. And the reason why is that the Bible is a very long and complex book. And it's very difficult to unify the Bible into one sort of method. And in that process of unifying the method of, or the understanding of Christianity, that process of unifying the Bible into one thing, one message, that you get all these different sort of denominations of Christianity. How do we read the Bible? How do we understand this passage in relation to this passage? Well, what about the fact that, like, Luke misquotes the Old Testament? Well, how do we deal with that, right? You get all these kinds of questions, and it's through those kinds of questions that you get different denominations of Protestantism. At a certain point, in the 19th century, really, you see a group of people come together and say, okay, this is getting out of control. So what we need to do is we need to establish, like, the Bible is not sufficient to establish the center of Christianity. It's too broad. It's too complex. There are too many different ways to read it, etc., etc., etc. And you see this series of pamphlets in which this is articulated called the Fundamentals, which is where we get our word fundamentalism. The idea being, we can all agree on the following, right? The virgin birth, the resurrection, the Trinity, right? You also get things in there which appear later in Christian discourse, original sin, for instance, penal substitution. Those get sort of grouped in there. But the point being is that, okay, we can all agree on this set of necessary and sufficient conditions that defines Christianity. This is the first move, or this is really the first time that this idea was articulated. Before the church was the arbiter, right? It was living, breathing people that were the arbiters that decided what was and what wasn't Christian. In the absence of that becomes the Bible. The Bible's insufficient, so we have to come up with a collection of doctrines that are as uncontroversial as possible, that are capable of defining what's Christian and what's not Christian. Now, what I want to point out, however, is that these collection of doctrines are, privilege certain parts of the Bible over others, right? So the virgin birth is privileged over, like, the Jewish blood curse, right? We want the curse of Jesus to wash over us for all eternity or something like that. Save the Jews, I think in the book of John. One gets privileged over the other. Certain passages get privilege over other passages. Paul, like, there becomes a crazy emphasis on Paul in this time, which is new. Martin Luther really, and it started with Lutheranism, but he really put an emphasis on Paul, which is interesting, right? The point of all of this is that it makes sense to me why people would want to define Christianity by some set of conditions. Further, I think atheists do this all the time, and I think they do it because in order to concretize something, in order to reduce the complexity so that they can attack particular doctrines, it becomes a move that's sort of necessary in polemics. But I think that move is actually somewhat inappropriate. The fact is, the only way to make sense of Christianity, I think, is to conceive of it, again, as a very long tradition, with lots of branching off points, with lots of bizarre sort of moves, right? Like all the heresies. You see some really bizarre heresies and bizarre reinterpretations of Christianity. The Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons fall into that category of things that are definitely not in the mainstream of Christian theology historically. They're definitely not. But at the same time, like, they emerge from this Christian lineage. Particularly Mormonism was an attempt to re-articulate Christianity for America, right? To bind God and country together. And it was as much a move to define the American nation as it was to define Christianity qua the American nation, right? So Jesus goes to the Native Americans and blah, 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 blah. It's to fit America into that Christian history, and you get really bizarre things out of it. So it's another version of Christianity trying to rebuild itself to adapt to a certain time and place. And you see these all the time throughout history, right? Some of which are deemed heretical, some of which get pulled into the mainstream of Christianity, some of which are controversial but not heretical, right? So liberation theology is not conceived of as something that is heretical per se, but it's controversial within the Catholic Church. I don't know how the Protestants would feel about it, but whatever. Point being is that instead of thinking, this is Christianity, this is not Christianity, right, and making this hard and fast move, what we have to realize is that, like the evolution of languages, there are lots of shades of gray, and the borders of what is and what is not Christian are actually very, very fuzzy. They're not something that is hard and fast. This is the, I think, proper way to conceive of Christianity. You might disagree with me, ye audience, and I'm going to post this as a video response to Matthew4nineteen, because we had a conversation about this, or are in the process of having a conversation about this. So you all might disagree with me, but please leave a comment and let me know, or leave a video response, even better, and let me know why you disagree with me. Thank you, and have a good day.